All right, let's jump right into this explainer. We're looking at a wildly satirical, absolutely fascinating piece of sports writing today. Dr. Dunkenstein's report on the catastrophic 2026 NBA Finals collapse of the San Antonio Spurs against the New York Knicks. Now, if you've been following the sheer raw talent on this young Spurs roster, what actually happened in this series is it's mind-boggling. And this author breaks it down in the most creative way imaginable. We're going to take a deep dive into the total mental and physical unraveling of a team that literally had a championship right there in its grasp. The author doesn't just call this a bad series. No, he frames the team's disastrous finals performance entirely through the lens of the 1970 Apollo 13 space disaster. Just imagine it, a highly trained crew, fully expecting to make history by walking on the moon, suddenly left stranded and completely bewildered in the deep, freezing void of space. That is exactly how Dr. Dunkenstein views the 2026 Spurs, a team that was flying so high, suddenly broadcasting to the entire world that something has gone terribly, terribly wrong. To really drive this point home, the report leans heavily into the dual meaning of the word meltdown, right? So in aerospace, a meltdown is a catastrophic failure of a rocket ship upon atmospheric re-entry due to extreme heat. But in sports, it's blowing a massive points lead and losing a highly winnable game because of a total loss of composure. The sheer genius of this report is how it intertwines these two definitions. It connects a literal space tragedy to the Spurs' unraveling on the basketball court, which, as we know, ultimately resulted in a devastating 4-1 series loss. Moving into the first section of the report, the Apollo 13 disaster, stranded on the dark side of the moon. The author drops us squarely inside this metaphor. Back in 1970, astronaut Jim Swigert attempts a totally standard procedure, but he flips the wrong switch in the command module to stir the oxygen tanks, and boom, massive explosion. Fast forward to 2026, and the Spurs players are out there repeatedly flipping the wrong fundamental basketball switches on the court. Dr. Dunkenstein brilliantly compares the self-inflicted damage of that space mission to the Spurs making these totally inexplicable, unforced errors, despite being the youngest team to ever reach the finals. Everything was going perfectly fine, and then a series of wrong choices sparked an absolute disaster. But the metaphors definitely don't stop in outer space. Here's Section 2, the Cuckoo's Nest Asylum, detained in the NBA bubble. So the explainer dramatically shifts from the cold void of the cosmos to the confines of a psychological ward, bringing in the classic 1975 film One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. The author diagnoses the team as being surrounded by people without proper perspective and totally lacking a sincere assessment of their own best interests. Basically, the report characterizes the Spurs as being involuntarily detained in an NBA Finals bubble of their own absurdity. Just like in the movie, they aren't just losing, they're losing games they absolutely should be winning, all because they're trapped in this loop of repetitive, completely uncorrected mistakes, enabled by everyone around them. Bridging the gap from those wild cinematic metaphors to the very painful on-court blunders brings us to Section 3, Symptoms on the Court, Mapping the Collapse. Let's look at the actual symptoms that cause this collapse. This timeline breaks down the jaw-dropping Game 2 catastrophe that handed the Knicks a 1-point, 105-104 win. Just look at this sequence. 11 seconds left on the clock. The score is tied. The Spurs have a chance to win or at least push it to overtime, right? But instead of executing a standard fundamental play, 7'5" Victor Wembanyama inexplicably tries to play point guard. He makes a ridiculous pass, literally hitting teammate Stephon Castle right in the back. Then, in the absolute chaos that follows, Wembanyama unexplainably rushes in and shoves Knicks guard Jalen Brunson out of bounds. The clock hits 0, and Brunson sinks the game-winning free throw. I mean, it is a historic, completely self-inflicted wound. And how exactly did the coaching staff react to this monumental error? Well, the author lays out a pretty brutal critique. Instead of taking charge, the source notes the coaches waved their hands and screamed from the sidelines like panicked cheerleaders. They inexplicably refused to call a crucial timeout in those final ticking seconds. They permitted their towering center to run the point guard position when the stakes were literally at their highest. And honestly, worst of all, they dismissed these historic errors in the post-game press conference as simply being young. The report absolutely blasts the staff for singing Kumbaya and handing out hugs instead of enforcing basic fundamental basketball rules. Now, if you thought Game 2 was bad, the sheer scale of the failure in Game 4 is captured in one single number: 29. The Spurs built and then completely blew a historic 29-point lead. To put that into perspective, according to the source material, this was the first collapse of this massive magnitude in 440 NBA playoff games. 440! That isn't just a tough loss, that is an unprecedented systemic failure. They had a massive advantage and literally just watched it melt away, minute by agonizing minute. The devastating closeness of these self-inflicted losses is just glaring. Game 1 was a 105-95 Knicks win, but Game 2, a 1-point win. Game 4, another 1-point win. And Game 5 was a super tight 94-90. This proves, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the Spurs were entirely capable of building leads and hanging with New York before completely and utterly self-destructing in the final minutes. The margins were razor-thin, which honestly makes those fundamental mistakes even more glaring. This brings us to our final section. The doctor's diagnosis, the coach on the couch. Here, Dr. Dunkenstein literally places head coach Mitch Johnson on the couch for a highly satirical clinical therapy session. It's time to figure out what exactly went wrong in the minds of the team's leadership. The report highlights this direct quote from Coach Johnson after a brutal loss, and you really have to let the absurdity of this cuckoo's nest logic sink in. He says, and I quote, "We just need to do the same things we were doing, but change the ending." Think about that for a second. You just lost an NBA Finals game by blowing a massive lead, your fundamentals totally collapsed, and your grand strategy is to do the exact same things but somehow magically expect a different outcome at the buzzer? The author uses this quote perfectly to highlight the absolute state of denial the team was operating under. So Dr. Dunkenstein diagnoses the team with a literal basketball disease. He connects the coach's media statement directly to Albert Einstein's famous definition of insanity, repeating the same action over and over and expecting a different result. The therapy session concludes that the entire organization is suffering from a massive disconnect from reality. You just cannot play basketball that results in blown leads and expect to win just by hoping the ending changes. As a final, highly sarcastic prescription, the doctor advises the coach to follow 3 very specific steps. 1. Sit alone in a room in complete darkness. 2. Listen to Pink Floyd's iconic album Dark Side of the Moon at maximum volume. And 3. Deeply contemplate your insane basketball performance. The author's point here is crystal clear. You must embrace the darkness to self-realize that you cannot simply repeat catastrophic, unforced mistakes and expect someone to hand you a championship trophy. You actually have to confront and fix the underlying fundamental issues. Which brings us to the end of our explainer. We leave you with this to wonder about. Can this incredibly young, historically talented team actually cure their self-inflicted basketball disease? Will they ever learn to execute basic fundamentals when the pressure is really on? Or will this epic 2026 meltdown permanently strand them on the dark side of the moon? What you should really take away from this is that talent alone doesn't win championships. Flawless execution and mental fortitude do. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive, and as always, keep questioning what you see out there on the court.